Hello and welcome to the show. This is Addis Dialogue from Ethiopian Broadcasting Corporation. In today's program, we'll examine where Ethiopia's economy is moving. According to economists or economic researchers, Ethiopia is the fifth largest economy in Africa and the third in sub-Saharan Africa. Besides, Ethiopia's 130 million population is also part and parcel of this. But what are the untapped resources of Ethiopia which can make Ethiopia's economy to move forward? In this regard, economists are saying Ethiopia has many potential and yet not utilized to its maximum potential. My guest for today is Mr. Zemedeneh Nigatu, CBE Capital Investment Bank CEO, Senior Advisor and Consultant. I'm your host, Gzacho Derib. Do stay with us. Mr. Zemedeneh Nigatu, welcome to Addis Dialogue and thank you for your time.
Thank you for having me.
How do you see Ethiopia's economic trajectory, be it in the aftermath of the reform and before the reform?
For a number of years, it was classified as the fastest growing economy in Africa, and rightly so. I mean, this is data from the IMF, the World Bank, and international sources. But I think what would be even more interesting for the viewers would be the contemporary, say, last few years, because there have been a number of global developments that had an impact globally and here in Africa and in Ethiopia. So if I look at the growth or the performance of the Ethiopian economy over the last, say, 5 years, I mean, we had the huge impact of COVID, which affected every country in the world, including where we grew up in the United States, Europe. The whole world was affected very severely. Africa, surprisingly, less so. And then, of course, Ethiopia also is part of that, the global community was affected. So we had that. And then right after that, obviously, the internal conflict in Ethiopia had an impact. And then subsequently, the Russia-Ukraine war, which, well, oil prices doubled, fertilizer prices tripled, all the commodities that countries like Ethiopia were importing, they went through the roof because of the conflict, right? Thankfully, some of that has subsided, but again, that was the case. So when you look at this and you say, well, what has been the economic performance of Ethiopia? One word I always use to describe it is resilient. I think that's probably the best way to describe the Ethiopian economy over the last 5 years, despite all these challenges, to have grown by, according to the World IMF, about 6.5% on average if you look at the last 5 years. The Ethiopian government has a bigger growth trajectory number. Like this year, for example, IMF is saying 6.4, Ethiopian government is saying 8+. Either way, these are very big numbers. In fact, to put it in perspective, of the 5 largest economies in Africa, Ethiopia, according to the IMF and the World Bank and other international sources, is the fastest growing economy. It's always good to compare peers, okay? It would not be appropriate to compare it to small countries in Africa, which do grow faster than us, but they have very small population, very small economies. But if you compare it to our peers, whether it's Nigeria, South Africa, or Kenya and other places, it is the fastest growing economy. And last year and the year before, and this year also, again, the forecast for 2025. So this is sort of a macro view of where the economy was, where it is today. Now, what is the outlook, I guess, is what I'm sure your viewers and you would like to know. So here we are sitting in an investment bank. We're very happy. We were granted a license last week. It's a historic event. So I'm looking at it both as an investor, as someone who analyzes economies, and also now as the new CEO of an investment bank. The investment banks, by design, we were supposed to invest. We're supposed to be involved heavily in capital markets. So we have outlooks of where we think it will go. We have recently set up our research department here as well. But we have global data, and obviously I operate globally. So I've tried to put things in context. So listen, I've always said this, the fundamentals of the Ethiopian economy, or what drives it, are still very attractive. What does that mean? What are the fundamentals? So if you look at agriculture, which is still a very significant component of the Ethiopian GDP, We have, by all accounts, currently cultivating about 20 million hectares. There are estimates that say Ethiopia has between 75 million to 100 million hectares of arable land. So we're only at 20 million. Imagine when we start moving to 30, 50, 70. I mean, this is untouched. And not only the size, but when we start mechanizing it, when we start modernizing agriculture, it has this huge transformation. We've seen it lately in the last few years. Transformation, for example, wheat production has increased very substantially, data that was provided by various sources, including the government. So this year, for example, we saw that coffee is doing extremely well. Record exports of coffee. What I say is, it is just getting started. I mean, think about it. So one is the fundamentals when I talk about it is that. Second, manufacturing. Is this a sector, by the way, I know very well, because here in Ethiopia, we have invested in a very large manufacturing company that produces clothing for the global market. So we export from Ethiopia. I think if done right, with the right focus, especially now with this new strategy called Made in Ethiopia, Make It in Ethiopia, okay? In America it's called Ethiopia Tamert. I think given those kinds of focuses, manufacturing, certain types of manufacturing, has a very significant upside potential by investing in Ethiopia. So when I talk about fundamentals, these are the kinds of things. Third, I'm just picking off the pillars of the homegrown economic reform, the 5 sectors. The third one is natural resources. Untouched, again, unexploited, underexploited. Again, we have a very good example recently, gold. For years and years and years, from what I remember, the data shows, Ethiopia was producing and exporting, $100 million, $200 million a year. The first 6 months of the year, the data that has been released shows that in just 6 months of the government's current fiscal year, Ethiopia has exported 1.5 billion. Okay? I mean, these are very large numbers. That's what I'm saying. We're just getting started. Okay? And if you look at potash, if you look at others, gas, for example, potentially. So, again, it requires the right kind of investment, the right kind of policies, but when executed flawlessly, these are significant drivers of economic growth. So when we talk about the other pillar, which I know is doable, it's a longer term, but the tourism sector, okay? If we look at our neighbor Kenya, last year I think they pulled in 2 million tourists, okay? We have virtually everything that Kenya has except maybe the beach, okay? We have historical tourism. Now Addis Ababa, as you've seen, has been transformed. It's become a very beautiful cosmopolitan city where there are things to do. We have a lot of conference attendees coming to Ethiopia. They come to Addis. In the past, really, to be very frank with you, there was no reason to stay beyond the conference, right? There was no places to, but look at it now. So again, tourism. Now, the other thing that I'm excited about, that I've been heavily involved in, even though I'm not a techie, is the technology sector. Now, it requires a lot of work. There's a lot of competition around the world for that. But that's also, I think, a potential. So when you just look at these 5 segments, 5 pillars, I think the fundamentals that I'm talking about that will drive the growth are there. We just have to make sure we have the right policies, we make the right investments, we invest in human capital. That's going to be, by the way, Ethiopia's biggest asset is not what comes out of the ground or anything, it's its people, right? Some of the data we see, something like 75% of Ethiopians are under 30. So that means it's a very young population, right? Very young, very mobile, very trainable, educated. If I give you the example of our factory, okay, just so that, I like practical examples, not just theory. Our factory in Ethiopia, it's a multinational company, I'm the chairman. Our productivity at our Ethiopian factory, because we've invested in our people and our employees, is equal to 90% of our European factory, okay? Even though our costs are much less than what it is in Europe, okay? So what I'm saying is, if you invest in new people, if you share the benefits of the growth properly, they will deliver for you. And many Ethiopians, most Ethiopians are willing to learn, are willing to be trained. So these are, I think, some of the things, Because a lot of people ask me, you're always optimistic, Zemedeneh, even when there are challenges. Yeah, there is no country. I've lived in a lot of countries. I still travel 80, 90% of my time around the world. I sit on a lot of boards around the world, something like 8 or 9 boards and companies and organizations around the world. And I've spent almost 30 years in big multinational companies. So my views are shaped by my experience. You know, I spent many years working in Latin America and Brazil and Argentina in emerging markets. So optimism is based on not just hope. Hope is not a strategy, but it's based on practical experiences. And growing up in America, I always said, how did the United States become so rich? You know, one of the things is it invested in people. It gave its people the space to thrive, to be creative, to build people like Bill Gates, okay? They were given the opportunity. There are a lot of talented Ethiopians, I'm sure, whose knowledge can match those that are available in the United States, if not exceed. So what we need to do here is give that creative space for people, for that space for people to be creative, to deliver. Now, one of the encouraging things I just want to add here, and then we can move on to the next question, is I see a beautiful, encouraging policy, which is the shift from a state-led economic model, which delivered in the early days, right? But now to a private sector-led, or at least where the private sector has a significant role. Okay, that is good. If we saw what happened in my role models for economic development, by the way, are the Asians, the Asian tigers. Yes, South Korea, China, Singapore, these countries. In our lifetime, they became wealthy. They were very poor countries, but they became very wealthy countries. And that's one of the reasons they did, is they invested in their people. They gave their people to be creative. Look at China. Like in Ethiopia, in the first early days, China started about 40 years ago, just 40 years ago, 4 decades. They went from a communist system where the state owned everything to gradually allowing the private sector to thrive. Initially, the state-led companies were driving the growth, but later on you see companies like Alibaba, companies like Huawei, private companies that thrived. I think that's where we're migrating as well. At least that's my expectation and my hope. The Ethiopian private sector is also on that kind of path. We are, again, as an investment bank and also as one of our major shareholder being a bank, we can see, we can track where lending is going. And if you see the government data, this past year, 80% of credit lending was given to the private sector. If you go back 3-4 years, it was the other way around. 80% to the state and state-owned enterprises, 20% to the private. So this is also very, very encouraging, because in the future, it's the Ethiopian private sector, obviously through partnership with the state, that will deliver economic transformation.
You have said that Ethiopia's economy is the 5th largest in Africa and the 3rd in sub-Saharan Africa, but the cost of living, according to people, is quite different, because people give meaning to the economic growth of Ethiopia according to their livelihood. What is existing in reality is as per their cost of living. That is a paradox. How do you see it being a senior consultant and a researcher in this regard?
Zemedeneh, you always come on the media, you write on Twitter and other places that the economy has the potential to grow, which has grown by X% and all that. But he said, what does it mean for the average person? You know? And the same question you asked me. He said, well, for example, inflation is high. I am on the record for the last several years. I have been on your program, on Ethiopian television. I've been on global television. When I discuss the Ethiopian economy, I've always discussed inflation. It's a fact. We have a highly elevated inflationary rate. We've had that. It became almost structural. For the last 15 years, the average inflation rate in Ethiopia was 15%. Yes, if you grow by 10, 11%, still have 15% inflation. Okay? Now, there is no denying that the growth is there, but the average person, like you and me and everybody else, who has to go to the shop to buy stuff, who has to pay rent, who has to pay transport costs, they say, well, wait a second, what does that mean? Yeah. I can't afford it. Things are getting expensive. This is the thing that economic transformation is needed for. Okay? I think, thankfully, in fact, the data for this month just came out. Inflation is down to 15%. 2 years ago, it was 30 plus. Okay? All these reforms that the government is doing, and the National Bank is publishing data, is showing that it is starting to pay off. It takes time. There's no question. I told you, when I lived in Latin America, for example, in Argentina, inflation was in the hundreds. When I worked in Brazil, inflation was in the hundreds. The currency was becoming, depreciating rapidly. Brazil got it right. Today, if you see, Brazil is like amongst like the 10th largest. So it takes time. But I think in the case of Ethiopia, again, the data that the National Bank published yesterday or a couple of days ago shows that is down to 15%. This is very, very encouraging. I'm hoping and I'm expecting in the medium term, it will come down to single digits, at least as close to single digits, okay? So I agree with you. For the average person to feel the growth, they need to see it in their life in terms of, especially inflation, which is something, the low-income earners, people on fixed income, it pains them even more than, say, wealthy people. So that is being addressed. For example, if you look at the tight monetary policies, which is painful, because credit right now in the banking sector is tight, but that's by design, okay, to rein in inflation. But in the short term, in the short to medium term, it is painful for the economy. But I've seen this where it worked, where if you bring it down to a sustainable single digit or close to single digit and sustain it at that level, it will have a very long-term positive impact on the economy. Because it's very difficult to manage businesses when you have high inflation. You don't know how to price your products, your services, right? It's very difficult to put together a budget for the government when inflation is high. And that's why I think give credit to the National Bank, give credit to the macroeconomic team of Ethiopia, which said, okay, we'll bite the bullet, we'll take the hit for the short term, but in a year or two from now, we'll reach a stable macro environment where inflation is low. It cannot, there were structural problems. For example, if you look at the wholesale retail distribution, I've been talking about this for a very long time. It was extremely inefficient. It was monopolistic. Only a handful of companies are importing food items. Only a handful of companies do the distribution. They're very primitive systems from 30, 40, 50 years ago when we had a very tiny little economy. And so they had the supply chain was filled by middlemen who add no value but add cost to the end user. I think that is being dismantled now. As you know, foreign investors are now allowed into the retail wholesale distribution system. Hopefully they'll come with their knowledge, their know-how, their expertise, and their capital to make it efficient. Is that the only solution? No, but I think increasing productivity, for example, is another solution. Because when you grow, but the demand and the supply are not in balance, and demand far outstrips the supply, you have inflation. So one of the solutions is to produce, especially produce domestically. I mean, these are just some of the tools that is being. So I'm hopeful. Inflation has now come down. It will come down to a level that's sustainable, hopefully in the single digits. And I think that would also help contribute to the growth. But you're absolutely right. I get asked all the time. What is it? You're always telling me economic growth and, okay?
From the previous mentality, changing the economic ecosystem of Ethiopia, private-public partnership has to come in place and play the key role. How do you see in this regard, from which the capital market is part and parcel of it, where you are CEO of it as well?
By definition, nowhere in the world are governments job creators. They shouldn't be. That's not the role of government, whether in the United States or anywhere in the world or Ethiopia. Government's role is to create an enabling environment for the private sector to thrive. Government has a role. For example, if the private sector is unwilling or unable to go into a particular sector that is critical for economic transformation, the state will step in, either on its own or through a partnership. But if the private sector has the ability, both it could be domestic private sector or foreign investors, but if the private sector is willing and able and can deliver, then let the private sector drive it, okay? So my view, and again, I told you the Asian examples. If you go back to Korea, and we've studied that when I was in business school, and I've seen it in live, in the late 60s and even early 70s, the Korean government actually severely monitored the performances of these giant chaebols like Hyundai or Samsung and other big companies that they thought and they expected to transform this Korea, even though they were private, okay? Even though they were private, they were given support by the state. They were considered to be the national champions, and they did become national champions. So when you talk about private-public partnership, you need to think of it in a broader term, like what the Asians have done, what China has done. The Chinese companies, whether it's Alibaba or Huawei or these big companies, actually, even though they're private, they came, the governments supported them to get to where they are. Now, some were state-owned from day one, and then they got privatized. But even the ones that were started as new private companies. So I framed the PPP in a broader term. On the one hand, the state will create the enabling environment, support them, monitor them, and check to see if they're delivering. But on the other hand, if that private sector is not there when it's needed, the state has to step in. So I'm not dogmatic. I don't like dogmatic approaches. Practical, implementable, specific to each country. And in the case of Ethiopia, it's a new private sector, maybe 20 years old. It's a teenager. It's constrained by the two C's, the financial capital and the human capital. So we need to focus on those, and the state can provide the support on those. And I think if we do that right, our private sector will grow. Foreign investors have been, as you know, for the last 5-6 years, Ethiopia has been amongst the 5 largest recipients of FDI in Africa. If you look at the UNCTAD report, which is available on the web, anybody can Google it, it has been amongst the 5 largest in Africa, okay? So there is capital coming in, but there's competition for capital around the world. Money goes where it's most welcome. In the United States, for example, there is no shortage of capital. They don't talk in billions anymore in America. They talk in trillions of dollars of capital. If you look at some of the fund managers that deploy capital around the world's largest asset manager manages $10 trillion. It's called BlackRock. It's a private company. So there is no shortage of capital. We just have to make ourselves, as Africans, as Ethiopia, for that capital to come here. For that capital to say, you know, Ethiopia is one of the more attractive places I want to deploy it. Okay? So we need to focus, we need to work on that to make sure. FDI, as I said, amongst the 5 largest. But if you look at FDI in total for Africa, last year was like $60 billion. Billion, that's all, for 54 countries. It's a drop in the bucket when we talk about trillions. So Africa by itself has an issue, has a problem of attracting capital. Yes, we're getting our fair share, considering out of the 54 billion we got last year, what, 4 billion? That's more than our fair share, actually. But the size of our economy and the trajectory that we're on, we probably should pull in 10 billion, 12 billion a year. And it is doable. And that's, again, an opportunity for Ethiopia because we're on that path. And recently, a few months ago, we, in partnership with the Brazilian Investment Bank, one of the biggest in Brazil, a $500 million investment fund for agriculture for Africa. It's based in Sao Paulo. I used to work in Sao Paulo, so it's based in Sao Paulo, but it is going to be invested in Africa, African agriculture, to transform African agriculture. We're going to be investing in value addition side of it, okay? Now, one of the 6 countries we've selected for investment is Ethiopia, okay? So maybe converting the beautiful Ethiopian coffee to Nespresso, okay? Something like that. So, or cocoa in West Africa, you know, believe it or not, the largest producers of cocoa are Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire. But apparently, there's virtually no chocolate factory in West Africa. That's the kind of stuff we want to help. The private sector, it's private capital, raised from around the world, to be raised from around the world, from big sovereign wealth funds, pension funds, and all. But to transform, that's the kind of thinking we have in Ethiopia. Even here at CB Capital, that's one of the things some of the things we do to be innovative, help transform the economy on our part, of course, within the mandate that we've been given. And that's why, again, I'm optimistic about the outlook.
Ethiopia's economy has a big potential in terms of both human and natural resources, but there are also many untapped resources in this regard. How do you see it? Ethiopia has 130 million population, and there are also many underground and surface resources as well, where foreign investors can have a chance to take part in this regard?
Let me, for example, focus on the capital market side of it. For example, now we have a new stock exchange. Actually, it's a securities exchange. It's beyond stocks. It does both stocks as well as fixed income securities. For example, bonds, whether it's treasury bills, corporate bonds, or government bonds. So it's actually a broader thing, but for explanation purposes, let's call it the stock exchange. So through the capital market, which is a new thing, the Ethiopian Securities Exchange, the stock exchange, was launched about a month and a half ago, maybe about 2 months ago. And as I mentioned to you, we are one of the first investment banks licensed in Ethiopia. The ecosystem is being created, is being expanded. Through that, both foreign and domestic investors now have an avenue to raise capital, to trade on the exchange. So let's say, for example, for foreign investors, because you asked me about that. Up until now, the main window for coming to Ethiopia is FDI, foreign direct investment. So you bring in, you build a factory, you set up whatever. That's good. It's worked, as I said, amongst the 5 top recipients of FDI. Now, we have an additional window, which is called portfolio investment. Portfolio investment through the stock exchange. So, but the fact that a company like CBE Capital exists now will give foreign investors who are not coming to the FDI window because they may be not ready, but maybe they're not in that kind of business. But these are financial investors, institutional investors, who want exposure to the Ethiopian economy through the exchange, through the stock market. So they will engage a company like an investment bank like ours and say, okay, Zemedeneh, CBE Capital, I want to deploy $10 million. Okay, I want you to go and buy from me stocks in X, Y, and Z companies listed on ESX. Okay, okay, because they are what's called mutual funds, big institutional investors. This is what they do every day. They deploy capital. Okay, most of them have sector-specific exposure that they want. Okay, so this is one new avenue that is now being opened up to foreign investors because the law allows foreign what's called portfolio investment. The other one is FDI, foreign direct investment. So through the portfolio investment now, we expect. Obviously, it's getting started. This is new, okay? It's, if we look at other emerging economies, it's a process. It takes time. But I would expect more and more foreign capital to come into Ethiopia through the portfolio investment. Now, I just want to emphasize something here. Portfolio investment is different from FDI because it can come in today, it can go out tomorrow. I mean, this is just the nature around the world, okay? But if you continue to be an attractive market, if you deliver good IRRs, returns for your investors, that capital can stay here, for a very long time. So, but it's an additional window for foreigners to get exposure to the Ethiopian market. Ethiopia, by the way, we shouldn't look at it as just a country in where you invest in. It's actually a regional economic powerhouse. So when we invest, for example, we always look at Ethiopia as a regional hub. Okay, whether it's for manufacturing, for other things. So these portfolio investors also looking at even though they come into our market, they would be looking at the regional performance of the economies and they would like to get. In the future, Ethiopian companies will go cross-border. Look at Ethiopian Airlines, the classic example of a multinational company created right here in Ethiopia, which is now operating in like 125 countries. It's one of the largest airlines in the world, has subsidiaries, offices around the world. Okay, that's what I expect many other Ethiopian companies in the future to go abroad. Maybe not to 100 countries like Ethiopian Airlines have done, but what is the banks, Ethiopian banks or Ethiopian manufacturers? So that means when you look at Ethiopia, you'll be looking at companies that is going out, expanding. Ethio Telecom could be one example. So that's why through the portfolio window, you can now gain exposure to companies who will be embarking on a regional investment approach. And I think that'll be attractive for investors.
Awesome. This is really much appreciated. With the interest of time, Mr. Zemedeneh Nigatu, let's end up our discussion for today. And thank you very much for your time and the critical analysis. Dear viewers and listeners, by this we come to the end of today's show. You can follow us on different social media platforms of Ethiopian Broadcasting Corporation. Goodbye for now.
Thank you for having me.